I'm very happy to be here, thanks to Mr. Sölter and thanks to Daniel Birnbaum for hosting this conference here. One thing I have to correct is I used to be, I'm professor at the University, and I used to be the head of the visual arts section because I went back a year ago into art history, but I think I'm excused for this decision, particularly in this room, because jag skriver en bok om Hilma af Klint. Jag skriver Hilma af Klints biografi. So that should be a good reason to leave journalism and go back into art history. I'm particularly honored that I could speak in the same panel as Christian Fuhrmeister, as he's very modest. He didn't mention that he is one really of the geniuses of provenance research in Germany. He and his two colleagues, Maike Hopp and Stefan Klingen from the Institute in Munich, have a worldwide reputation, and people from all over the world turn to them if they try to track down an item. So yeah, if you search for something, there's the Sherlock Holmes to find it. And yeah, I'm going to speak about Germany's biggest mistakes in restitution politics and how to avoid them. And I'm going back to a lot of research I've done while I was still working at the newspaper, and I commented a lot on restitution cases we had in Germany. And while Germany has a very good reputation, I think internationally, and rightfully so, for dealing with its history and taking responsibility for its history, restitution politics is a very peculiar case, and it has often failed to do well. And I'll speak about the causes a little bit, and I think I could also offer a perspective what could be learned from it, what Germany could learn from it, but maybe also Sweden. So I'd start with it. Yeah, no, that's fine. I start with the first slide, and I'm starting with a book that had been published in Sweden by an author called Fredrik Sjöberg, and it's called Yuppie Dog, moron kan det vara för sent. And it just came out in Germany this summer, and it deals with two artists, and I like to start with it because it ties our story to Sweden also. So the artist you see here, she has done this painting, and that's a self-portrait. It's called Lotte Laserstein. Lotte Laserstein was born in Germany. She was educated as an artist in Berlin. She was actually one of the first women who were allowed to study art in Germany. And she came from a Jewish family, and when the National Socialists took power, she migrated to Sweden. She was actually invited in 1937 to do an exhibition here, and then she decided to stay. Unfortunately, her mother, who came first with her, returned to Germany and was killed by the National Socialists because she didn't want to stay in Sweden, and she took certainly the wrong decision. Sjöberg is interested in two artists in this book. One is Lotte Laserstein, the other one is a Swedish one called Olof Ågren. And he's interested in the question why these people peaked at a certain point and had a very sort of rich and fulminant work, and then sort of ceased to be sort of interesting artists and also got forgotten. And next slide, please. He gives one explanation, and I have the English translation here. He says, and he's fully aware, he's not the cynical himself, he's just repeating kind of a cynical perspective of why Lotte Laserstein got forgotten, and I'm showing this because that's in the Moderna Museet, isn't it? This painting? Yeah. So, and he says, if she, Lotte Laserstein, had been arrested and if she had died in some camp like other members of her family, her paintings would have been praised shortly after the war. Believe me, I know almost everything about the mechanisms of shame. So the logic is here that Germany sort of that because so the logic is here, if she had died, then people would have praised her and her reputation would have been a higher one. And actually, this sounds very cynical, this is also a perspective Germany would like to see. Because what particularly the Bundesrepublik Deutschland did after the Second World War was to claim that sort of a lot of people had been prosecuted by the National Socialists, a lot of artists had been prosecuted, and we are putting them back on stage. So a lot of museums were founded, the Documenta were founded, and the rhetoric of that was saying, so, you know, maybe we couldn't protect them during National Socialism, but this is the new Germany, and now we are putting them on stage, and that we are giving them a public audience. Next slide, please. Actually, this is only partly true, because there was a very selective memory in the years after the Second World War, and there was a very specific logic to the question who was remembered and who was forgotten. Lotte Laserstein was forgotten, but another person was also forgotten, and that is Otto Freundlich. Otto Freundlich was also a Jewish artist. He got very famous for his sculptures, and he died in 1943 in a concentration camp. Next one, please. Alfred Flechtheim was a very prominent art dealer. He had to flee Germany in 1933, and we'll hear more about him. He died in London in exile, and he was also completely forgotten in the post-war years. Next slide, please. All of them had been heavily prosecuted by the Germans, and I'm showing just some examples. Alfred Flechtheim found himself in a nasty caricature on one of the posters for the exhibition Entartete Kunst, Degenerate Art, which took place in 1937. And he was, in the propaganda, he was the Jewish art dealer who caused sort of the success of degenerate art in Germany. Second one, Otto Freundlich, this is one of his sculptors that was on the cover of the exhibition guide of Entartete Kunst. And third one I have here, this is a picture by Lotte Laserstein that was in a public museum and that was confiscated by the Germans in 1937 because it was believed to be degenerate art, and degenerate art meant sort of that German officials thought it would not suit German identity and had to be destroyed because of that. All of them have in common, they were Jewish, they were heavily prosecuted, they were not allowed to work anymore. The Nazis tried to destroy their work, they were either forced to flee outside the country and they were killed if they stayed. But these were not the people who were remembered in the post-war years. The person who was most prominently remembered as being prosecuted by the Germans, the artist, was this one. Next one, please. Emil Nolde. Emil Nolde was an expressionist German painter who became part of a National Socialist Party in 1934, which became later part of the official NSDAP. He was a heavy anti-Semite. He was very much surprised when he was included in the exhibition Degenerate Art. Actually, there were many socialists who would rather not have him in there, but there were also some who thought that it was degenerate art. Nevertheless, he stayed a member of the National Socialist Artistic Association. He was allowed to sell it and to work as an artist until 1941, when he earned so much money that one of the National Socialists said that he should stop being sort of accumulating all this riches, and he was kicked out of the Reichskammer der Bildenden Künste, the artistic organization, and was not allowed to sell and to exhibit anymore. He became the most famous artist in the post-war years. He was the one to be remembered, and he was sort of the most prominent victim of the National Socialist in the post-war years. And the reason he became the most prominent victim was because he had the same troubled history most of the people had in the German art world. Because everyone who was not in line with the National Socialists was kicked out. So the people who stayed would be the same people who were there in 1937, 1938, 1951, 1960. There was a long continuation of that. Next slide, please. Next. So sort of the myth that came about in the post-war years was actually that German museums themselves, because the Nazis confiscated works from them, that they were the victims. That works had been taken from German museums, that German museums were not part of National Socialism, but that they were the victims, which is, to say the least, very one-sided, not to say it's a lie, because German museums collaborated on many different levels with the National Socialists. And just to name one, it was often German museum directors who would help the National Socialists to find the Jewish collections and to point out the pictures that should be confiscated by the National Socialists and looted. So that there was a very selective memory. The only thing one remembered was the confiscation of works from German museums, and the myth came about. Next slide, please. And that I would call error number one, the myth of the Renitent Museum. And that blocked restitutions for a long time because the idea was we had been the victims, why should we give anything back? So that was the first error. And I think this romantic idea of the museum that is there for the public and doesn't do anything wrong is often an argument against restitution. I think we have to look in the troubled history of our museums and also what the museum directors, often they had links to people who were connected with National Socialism, or in Germany they were National Socialists themselves. Second error. Second error, and Catherine talked about this yesterday brilliantly, is signing the Washington Declaration, and we heard that signing is not wrong, but I'm still using it, so sort of endorsing, is the right word, right?
Yes.
Endorsing the Washington Declaration without caring about research and who's in charge in restitution cases. So there was sort of the goodwill, but no practical steps were taken. I'm just bringing up one example to show you what kind of tohu wabohu happened in Germany after that. Second, yeah. So this is the case of Rudolf von Alt, and he takes us to Austria in the 19th century. Rudolf von Alt was a very famous painter of watercolors in the 19th century. This is the Stephansdom in Wien. He was very famous for that. He produced hundreds of paintings of the Stephansdom in Wien, and it was very popular. He was one of the favorite painters of the Kaiser, of the Austrian Kaiser, but he was also one of the favorite painters of the Jewish bourgeoisie, because it was about that time that they got full civil rights in Austria, and they sort of developed a strong attachment to the state that gave them the full civil rights. So there were a lot of Rudolf von Alts in Jewish collections. Unfortunately, a big fan of Rudolf von Alt was also Adolf Hitler. He was actually sort of his role model and the one he tried to copy when Hitler tried to enter the academy and was declined. But the kind of painting style he tried to produce himself was Rudolf von Alt's painting. Next slide, please. Then in 1938, a lot of Rudolf von Alt paintings were taken by the National Socialists who had seized Austria, and they were looted from Jewish collections, and then they ended up in Munich in the Staatliche Graphische Sammlung in Bavaria. The interesting thing is they weren't researched for a long time. Even when Jewish family turned to the museum, they were turned down and they said, no, we don't have anything looted there, until actually one person from the, he's not the director, right? He's the
Curator.
A curator from the Staatliche Graphische Sammlung said we have to do something about it, and we're going to research that. And it was clear cases of looted art. So one Jewish family, turned to the museum and said, I think you have a looted artwork by us. And he said, okay, we'll look into it. They researched it and was clear cut, this is a looted artwork. So and now comes the kind of Kafka story. So it's not, and I think this is we have to understand, it's not just down to the museum who's gonna restitute a painting. So this curator turned to the Ministry of Culture and said, we have this case of a looted artwork, we have looked into it, it is looted, we would like to return it. The Ministry of Culture said, fine, fine with us, turned to the Ministry of Finance, what they say. He turned to the Ministry of Finance, and the Ministry of Finance said, oh, fine, yeah, no, this is looted, and you should return it, but please pay us the amount that the painting is worth, because it belongs to the state, and the treasure of the state cannot be diminished. And it's worth about 80,000, please pay us 80,000. So we are in the situation now where a public institution should pay a public ministry 80,000 euros for a painting that was looted. So the curator actually did a very brave thing. He went public. He'd made a public conference. And there was a public outcry because also in previous cases, the museums were told that they had, that's a Bavarian case, that they had to pay the money to the state in order to be able to give them back. There was a public outcry, and then this law was omitted. But I think still we have to understand, and in Germany, and we also talked about, Catherine also talked about this yesterday, in Germany it's not just the museum directors, they have to speak to politics, and because it is down to the several states, the culture is down to the several states, there's a very complex structure, and I think we are in need of clarifying the structure in order to go ahead with restitution. And the same is true for provenance research. Christian has taken up, Catherine has taken it up. We have now a central institution giving out money to provenance researchers, but the money is limited. I think it's about 8 million now we have, but still we have so many different institutions, and still it's more or less down to the museum. It's a kind of hobby horse of curators to do it, rather than to do it, rather than have finance from outside. And I'm also not in favor of often the museum doing it itself is not a good idea. Next slide. Error number 3. Setting up a commission for restitution without any representatives from the Jewish communities. So we've heard about this in length yesterday. Now we have 2 representatives from the Jewish communities. This was also a German peculiarity for a long time, and we also heard the horrible quote by Monika Grütter saying that they would be biased, but fortunately one also has to say Monika Grütter in the end was the Minister of Culture who changed that, so that is a good thing. 4? Oh yeah, I just wanted to give the full title of the Limbach Commission, Advisory Commission. So that's our commission, Advisory Commission for the Return of Cultural Property seized as a result of Nazi persecution, especially Jewish property. And I think if you read the full length of it, it's I don't know, it's just not understandable why we didn't have Jewish representative for such a long time. Error number 4, telling Cornelius Gurlitt what to do and doing something else yourself. So I think, next slide. I think you have all heard about this case, which was very prominent, which came about in 2013. And the case was that Hildebrand Gurlitt, the father of Cornelius Gurlitt, was a very prominent dealer for the National Socialist, and he had a collection. I wouldn't really call it a collection, but he sort of assembled a lot of pictures himself, kept them, hid them from the public often. Some of them were shown, some of them were hidden, and then he inherited everything to his son Cornelius Gurlitt. Next slide. That's him. And then suddenly, sort of, the news break that sort of in the middle of Munich you have this kind of time capsule of a collection assembled during National Socialism. This story has many levels, and I don't want to go into it too much. I think one important level is that now it has turned out that probably very few of the pictures are now considered looted art, which does not mean that this collection doesn't have the kind of history we've heard about, but it probably also means that Hildebrand Gurlitt got rid of pictures very early. But as the situation is now, there are very few looted art pictures. I think what is very important about the story is that these were private people. We have talked about museums a lot. These were private people. And because it was such a big scandal, and because it was a private person, German politicians suddenly were very fierce when it came to restitution. They were very clear what should be done, and that in cases of doubt it should be restituted, and that everything should be online. So the business books of Cornelius Gurlitt went online. None of the German museums has ever put any business book online. Everything went online. The politicians were very clear that this should be done. And I think this is not how it should go. I'd rather see it the other way around. I think the public museums should set the standard, and the private people could learn from it and look up to it. In Germany, unfortunately, it's sort of upside down. Whether Cornelius Gurlitt was put under pressure or not, in the end, he did sort of the most far-reaching things that have been done in restitution in the history of Germany as a private person. And I consider this very unfortunate, that it's this way around. My last point. Error number 5, thinking that it will be over soon. I think we're going to talk about this topic for long. Cornelius Gurlitt is just one case. I think there are a lot of, there are more and more archives that are being discovered. The data banks are getting fuller and fuller. I think there's a new generation now that doesn't try to hide these things anymore, and really wants to deal with that history. Okay, you're shaking your head. I think so. We're going to talk about looted art for a long time, and I think it will. And we've heard about this already. This discussion will expand, and I see a lot of parallels now to what is being discussed in ethnological museums. And next slide, please. And Raphael Gross has talked about yesterday about the case of the Cape Cross. And I think it's almost like, history doesn't repeat itself, but it rhymes. We are hearing the same arguments again. I think we're going to go to the same process again. So when in Germany this discussion started about objects from colonial times, so the first argument was, oh, but they're in very good hands now. They are in beautiful museums and they have all the technologies and we take care of them and they're shown to the public, so they should stay here. And we have heard this argument was also put forward against restitution for looted art. It was said now they're good of the public and it's like a human right to look at them and they shouldn't be returned to private homes. So this argument is coming up and it's often false. I mean, we have a lot of cases where we have beautiful museums also outside Europe. So we really have to look into this prejudice. But one thing I would like to bring up, next slide, is this discussion now, and I think this is also why it's going to be big, it's already up there in pop culture, and I'm sure all of you will recognize this scene, which is from Black Panther, which is my favorite scene in Black Panther, and it is in a place in the British Museum. And what happens here is that Njadaka, who's played by the wonderful Michael B. Jordan, enters the British Museum and looks at something in a glass case and recognizes that it belongs to the people he comes from. So the land, the fictive land, is Wakanda, and this is a piece from Wakanda and is made out of vibranium. She doesn't know that. She's the curator. She's wrong about this piece. And this is also, I think this is so brilliantly observed because often these objects are wrongly categorized in European museums because they don't have the background and they don't have the knowledge of what the meaning of this object is. So he first corrects and says, actually, this is made out of vibranium, a mighty element. It's made out of vibranium and I want to have it. And she goes like, oh no, we are here, we are in a museum, you can't just take it. And he goes like, so what do you think your ancestors did? Did they ask for it? So, and in the end, he takes it. Yeah, you should watch it. It's on YouTube. So I think this argument will spread and this discussion will be there for a long time. Thank you very much.